Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Salebox for the week of the 30th of September 2013. My name is TotalBiscuit, taking a look at the Steam weekly deals. Nobody told me these were going on. Apparently these have been going on for months, and Valve didn't see fit to put them on the Steam page. They were only under the Steam newsfeed, which I actually never read, which is a little embarrassing, but there you go. So they've now decided to put their Steam weekly deals up on the front page under a spotlight called Week-Long Deals, which is pretty useful. So this gives me an excuse to bring back the Salebox once a week to cover these deals, so that you have an idea of which of these are worth avoiding and which of them are worth looking into. So, let's kick it off, shall we, with Victoria 2. 75% off, that is $5, €5, and £3.74. Victoria 2 is a grand strategy game brought to you by Paradox. It's essentially a game about managing a 19th century state, and for the most part, it's focused on economic and diplomatic aspect. It does have war, it does have conflict in it, but the system is a little bit de-emphasized in comparison to certain other titles like, say, Hearts of Iron. It is generally a well-received title. It apparently has a lot less micromanagement than some of the other grand strategies by Paradox, and is considered to be fairly accessible. Just bear in mind, of course, though, when I say fairly accessible, I mean relative to other Paradox grand strategy games, so don't expect to dive in and become instantly familiar with it. It will take a little bit of work. It's a pretty interesting time to actually set a game in, as far as I'm concerned. The 19th century going into early 20th, and the warfare system kind of evolves from your standard armies going all over the place and wrecking stuff to sort of World War I style trench warfare over the course of the game, which I find to be particularly interesting. If you like messing around with the economy as well, the game focuses a lot on industrialization, so that's a pretty interesting thematic element that is accurately reflected in the game mechanics. Might very well be worth looking at, and it's a good price for this particular title if you're looking for something a little bit slow-paced, a little bit cerebral, and, of course, stacked full of an almost nauseating amount of detail. SpeedRunners, 50% off. That is $5, €5, £3.49. That's a fairly surprising deal, considering SpeedRunners has only been out for a couple of weeks now. It is a speedrunning game, as you might imagine. It is by TinyBuild, who brought you There Is No Time to Explain, which was a rather fantastic title. This is technically still in early access, by the way. It's not finished, but for some reason they're putting it on sale anyway, which is a little weird. They've also put the 4-pack on sale. This is designed as a speedrunning game to be played competitively with 3 other people, and that allows you to use different weapons in order to try and slow down your opponents. It's a bit Mario Kart-esque, actually, with some precision platforming and speedrunning involved with it. It's got both local and online co-op. What I can say for certain is that Northern Lion's been enjoying the hell out of this, as I think you can clearly see in the background there. It seems like an ideal game to play with your friends if you want to get super angry about everything, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the absolute best way to play games with friends. So that might well be worth looking into. If you're going for single player, though, probably not. There are many better options if you're looking for a platforming game. This title is more about competitive speedrunning with other people, and it's always going to be more fun if you happen to know those people. So, you know, you can shout at them the day after. PixelJunk Monsters Ultimate, 50% off. That is $10, €9.49, and £7.49. Okay, so this one is a tower defense game. It was ported over from the PlayStation platform quite recently, although the game is relatively old comparatively. It involves tower defense against a variety of nasty beasties that are coming in the general direction of your village. And it has a rather curious graphic style, I've got to say. Some people are absolutely going to hate it. Some people will find it kind of adorable. It's definitely not chibi or anything along those lines. It's actually quite unique, although some would describe it maybe as a little bit simplistic. It's very pastel in nature. Now, the game does have a couple of interesting mechanics going for it, including the idea that your builder is actually a entity within the world, and you can take damage by running into things, so you got to be just a little bit careful. And also, upgrades don't necessarily cost money, they cost time. So you've got to consider if you have enough time to walk over to a tower and upgrade it as the enemies come directly at you. It's pretty fun, but we are talking about a genre that is very, very saturated, I feel, on the PC platform, not only with commercial titles, but also with mods for almost every game imaginable. So, on the scale of tower defense games, I still think that titles like Defense Grid or like Anomaly 2 are better than PixelJunk. I feel they're stronger titles. But if you are in the market for a tower defense game that does have a few nice quirks up its sleeve, then you could definitely do worse than PixelJunk Monsters. Sugar Cube Bittersweet Factory. What? 66% off. Taking it down to $2.37, €2.03, and also £1.69. A generally fairly well-regarded but short puzzle platformer. It actually won the Independent Games Festival China in 2010. While the game might look a little bit like Fez in terms of its actual aesthetic, it is a puzzle platformer which involves flipping the background over, which can result in revealing different things as you go, which is fairly interesting. It is not a game that I personally have had too much experience with, I have to admit, because it's not the kind of game that I go out of my way to play. But it's generally well regarded as a decent few hours of puzzle platforming fun for a relatively cheap price. So that would be about as far as my recommendation goes, I think, there, in terms of Sugar Cube Bittersweet Factory. Sword of the Stars The Pit, 75% off. That's $2.50, €2.50, £1.75. This is a roguelike set in the future, so a bit of sci-fi going on here. It is set in the world of Sword of the Stars, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, because, well, that's not exactly a title that really brings to mind a rich and colorful universe. So that's a little bit strange, but it is a roguelike in the very traditional sense of the word, which means that everything is turn-based. When you move, the enemy moves. It's rock hard. It's got a lot of inventory management and a really nice graphic style that reminds me of a slightly higher res version of great PC titles like, say, XCOM and Syndicate and things like that. I like the graphic style a lot. I think it's very nicely imagined. It's a tough game, and it's very, very enjoyable as well. The DLC, Mind Games, is also 50% off. If you're looking for something rock hard that fits the traditional rogue-like experience, then The Pit is a great choice, in my opinion. I enjoyed my time with it very much, and I like the fact that, unlike most roguelikes, it's actually set in the future as opposed to a fantasy world. Renegade OPS, 75% off. That's $3.74, €3.24, and £2.49. Annoyingly enough, this is published by Sega, but I feel that if I were to ignore the Sega titles in these week-long deals, then I wouldn't actually be giving you a full impression of the deals, which seems a little silly. I'm kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place when it comes to this one, so I'm going to err on the side of give you complete information. Seems to make most sense. Renegade OPS is actually by the studio that brought you Just Cause 2. It's a couple of years old now. It is a really great twin-stick shooter. It's one of the best on PC as far as I'm concerned. It has this very big G.I. Joe feel to it, and it does so in a really good way. It is focused very much on vehicular combat. It's got a fairly open world, which is quite nice. It's not entirely open, but there's plenty of stuff to do. There's lots of side objectives, and the pyrotechnics in that game are just fantastic. There's also 4-player online co-op available, as well as various DLC packs which bring in more characters. The PC version actually has Gordon Freeman in his buggy as a playable character, and yes, you can summon antlions. The game is cheesy fun. I think it's very, very well executed for what it is, and it is cheap as chips as well, which is always nice to see. Wasteland Angel, 75% off. That is $2.49, €2.49, and £2.24. Avoid at all costs. It's bloody awful. Had the misfortune of playing this 2 years ago for WTF Fizz, and it was dull, incredibly so. It has really poor sound assets. It is just car combat arena shooting with a post-apocalyptic feel to it in the most boring way possible, which is hilarious. How do you make car combat boring? Well, ask Wasteland Angel, because it very much is. It is incredibly dull. It's got weak weapons, terrible sound effects, lousy voice acting, and the biggest problem that I've got with it is it just has no sense of movement. It's got no momentum. You don't get to drive around the place like, say, Renegade OPS. You know, the game that I just mentioned is better than this in every way. And it costs the same. Do not buy Wasteland Angel, you silly, silly people. It is definitely not worthwhile. The only thing that this game had going for it was a kind of first-person mode, but it was completely phoned in, and as a direct result, a waste of time. So, on second thoughts, let's not go to the future. 'Tis a boring place. Ignite, 75% off. That is $2.50, €2.50, and a £1.75. This is a pretty generic racing game, honestly. There's not honestly a lot to write home about. I covered this in WTF-a-thon 2 years ago. I didn't really think much of it back then, and I still don't. It doesn't really offer anything that other racing games don't offer. It's pretty much budget. From a graphical standpoint, it looks alright. It gives a reasonable impression of speed, but what bothers me is that it just doesn't have a single shred of originality in it, and its mechanic is nitros, which is in like every racing game ever. So that is definitely not a selling point. Honestly, there are so many other racing games that you could pick up that are solid and actually have a bunch of worthwhile content in it. Ignite really does not qualify, so that would be a miss, I think, even at that price. Warlock, Master of the Arcane, 75% off. That is $5, €5, £3.74. This is a rather nice fantasy-themed turn-based strategy game. It's pretty easy to get into, especially if you've ever played Civ 5, because a lot of the mechanics in the game are reasonably similar, especially when it comes down to movement and combat. It's nice, actually. I enjoyed Warlock quite a bit. I did a couple of playthroughs of it, and I thought that it was really enjoyable, personally. It's got a nice aesthetic, it's got a reasonable amount of replayability, and a nice selection of spells and demonic beasties that you can either fight or summon to your side. All of the DLC is also 75% off as well, and it's for the most part pretty decent, including new races and game modes and things like that, so yeah, I mean, if you're looking for a little bit of turn-based strategy fun, it's not massively in-depth, I've got to say. It doesn't have a huge learning curve either, but it isn't the most difficult of games. So if you're looking for high strategy, you're not going to really find it here, but it's a good laugh. It's a solid fantasy strategy game for what it is. It just doesn't necessarily do anything that's really worthy of massive adoration. It's just one of those games that they're good, but they're not amazing, and they're not necessarily anything you would shout from the rooftops about, but they're solid and they're fun. Hamilton's Great Adventure, 80% off. That is $2, €2, and £1.59. This, to me, is like a must-buy at this price. It is actually a very enjoyable game indeed. It looks a little bit like a kid's game, but it absolutely isn't. It's very much a puzzle game with an interesting style to it that involves planning your moves carefully. It's developed by Fat Shark, the guys that made Lead and Gold, Crater, and War of the Roses. As far as I'm concerned, this is actually the best game that they've made up to this point. It's a very competent and highly enjoyable puzzle title, which I think you should definitely look into, and it's certainly not forgiving either. You will be murdered in a wide variety of different ways as you go on with your great adventure. I did a full video on it. It's kind of difficult to explain without watching how the gameplay works, so if you are a little bit curious, then check out my WTF is on Hamilton's Great Adventure. Just bear in mind that this game does not support Windows XP, so you'll need Vista or Windows 7, or of course 8, in order to try this one out. But it's good, you know, it's really, really solid. I think it's fantastic, especially for that price. There's no real argument there. And finally, Fist Puncher, 50% off. That is $5, €5, £3.49. This is a game that I hoped I would like, but I ended up not enjoying all that much at all. It's a brawler, but in my opinion, it's simply not a very good one. I had a wide variety of reasons for disliking it, including the, quite frankly, hideous art style, which really did not help the game in any way, shape, or form. I'm okay with retro style, I'm not okay with ugly retro style, which is certainly how I would describe Fist Puncher, I'm afraid, in that respect. It also simply had combat that didn't have enough impact to it. It was very, very floaty. And frankly, it felt more spammy than strategic, which is really not what I was looking for there. So, unfortunately, I've got to say that that game is very much a miss for me. I did not enjoy it all that much. There you go, folks. There is a roundup of this week's sale for Steam. Of course, there are other daily deals that tend to pop up, but this is the week-long deals, and they will be available until 10 AM PST on the 7th of October. My name has been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.